Try Fidelity. What's it cost to invest with the Fidelity app?
Start with as little as $1 with no account fees or trade commissions on U.S. stocks and ETFs.
That's music to my ears.
I can only talk.
Investing involves risk, including risk of loss. Zero account fees apply to retail brokerage accounts only. Sell order assessment fee not included. A limited number of ETFs are subject to a transaction-based service fee of $100. See full list at fidelity.com/commissions. Fidelity Brokerage Services, LLC, member NYSE, SIPC.
This episode is brought to you by GMC. GMC certified service technicians are factory trained to fit your vehicle with the tires specifically developed for it. And with our tire price match guarantee, you get the best fit for the best deal. Let us do the work. Available on select eligible tire brands at participating dealers only. Offer ends 12/31/2025. Terms apply. See dealer for complete details. Visit gmc.com/service to learn more.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Northern Kentucky University political scientist Michael Baranowski. I'm joined today by my conservative counterpart, University of Austin economist and former congressional staffer, Tim Kaine. Hey, Tim.
Mike, great to be with you, man.
Yeah, I am looking forward to doing this. Is the first time we've had an opportunity to do the show, just the two of us, and we have a lot to talk about. I thought, well, this week we're going to be talking a lot about legal cases because it's not a secret to anyone that in his second term, President Trump has been testing constitutional boundaries. Really, no U.S. president has done certainly in my lifetime. Of course, the courts aren't designed to move at warp speed. And so it's really taken a while for us to start to get some sort of clarity on just how many of these boundaries judges are going to okay the president to cross. And in this last week, we have seen a number of legal defeats for the Trump administration, though I guess maybe I should call them setbacks because the Supreme Court hasn't spoken on any of the cases we're going to be talking about today. And the first of these cases is the conservative Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals finding that President Trump cannot use the Alien Enemies Act to deport Venezuelan migrants alleged to be members of the Tren de Aragua gang. And this all started back in March when President Trump issued the proclamation, invocation of the Alien Enemies Act regarding the invasion of the United States by Tren de Aragua. So pretty clear what he was doing in that executive order. And in this, though, the president declared that Tren de Aragua is perpetrating, attempting, and threatening an invasion or predatory incursion against the territory of the United States. Now, the Alien Enemies Act only applies to a foreign nation or government, but the president's argument is that Tren de Aragua is so closely tied to the Maduro regime that it's a de facto part of the government. Well, 2 of the 3 judges on the Fifth Circuit reviewing this case did not buy the administration's argument, and writing for the majority, Judge Leslie Southbrook concluded, countries encouraging its residents and citizens to enter this country illegally is not the modern-day equivalent of sending an armed, organized force to occupy, to disrupt, or to otherwise harm the United States. There is no finding that this mass immigration was an armed, organized force or forces. Writing in dissent, Trump-nominated Judge Andrew Oldham accused the majority of ignoring the deference that presidents rightfully receive in national security matters, arguing that if determining the United States is being invaded, that's exclusively a presidential power. And Oldham wrote, our unelected court has overridden an action of the most democratic and politically accountable official in all the land, and that the majority was treating the president as, in his words, some run-of-the-mill plaintiff in a breach of contract case needing to convince the federal judge that he is entitled to relief. Now, the majority did agree that it's possible gang members are working with the Venezuelan government, but even if that were the case, it still wouldn't meet the criteria for invoking the Alien Enemies Act, according to the majority. They made their criteria fairly clear, writing, we define an invasion for the purposes of the AEA as an act of war involving the entry into this country by a military force or at least directed by another country or nation with an hostile intent. And it's worth noting that prior to President Trump, no U.S. president has invoked the Alien Enemies Act during peacetime. So that's kind of the background on this. Tim, What's your take on this ruling?
Well, my take is it makes sense. I think we've got to keep a perspective that I was going to say the White House. Boy, this is really President Trump. It's one of the things he believes most strongly in, and it's basically why he's president, that he said that sure looks like an invasion at the southern border, certainly chaos, and he's applied many strategies to stop illegal immigration. I would emphasize the illegal. And I think, Mike, I published a book on this called The Immigrant Superpower. So I'm in favor of greater immigration, but it can't be lawless. And I'd say this is a setback, certainly, for the president and his strategy, but he's approaching this issue on many fronts. And I think he's winning for the most part. This one is a setback, but net, the Trump administration, I think with the approval of the American people, is working really aggressively to stop the flow of illegal immigration. Now, what the judge said, and what we've got to respect, is that words have meaning. So an invasion, the judge said no. And as I said, it got to a point of ridiculousness 2 or 3 years ago with Biden when you saw just a flood of people. And there was some violence, brick throwing of anybody trying to prevent them from coming in. And the Border Patrol had been emasculated to where they weren't patrolling. They were just processing. They were supposed to just take your name and tell you to show up at a court in 7 years. It had gotten to a level of ridiculousness. So I think the judge maybe got this right technically, but I still think Trump is winning, and he's winning in the political sphere. I think it's a good idea that we all respect the words have meaning of the law, and we not erode that. That cuts both ways. And I think we're going to get into it later when we talk about some other words like Department of Defense or Department of War. The word matters.
Yeah. I'm actually a little torn on this because I do agree with the dissenting judge that when we're talking about national security and foreign affairs, the president is due a large amount of deference. But I also think there's still a role for the courts to play in determining, in this case, whether or not the activity of a foreign-based gang in the U.S., whether that constitutes governmental activity. And I think actually at times that it could. For instance, I mean, Iran, North Korea, they're all state sponsors of terrorism. There's some pretty clear links. I could see this being a reasonable argument. And this actually is, I don't think this is an easy call. I mean, the standard for, what's the standard for what constitutes an invasion and who gets to make that call? These are tough decisions. And I could see this going either way at the Supreme Court. In the end, I think the Supreme Court sides with the administration here, kind of 5-4, 6-3 situation, because it's not a bad argument, actually, even though it's not something I'm in favor of. And I'm trying to separate what I like in terms of policy as opposed to what I think is constitutionally or legally permissible. Because to me, the biggest problem here is a due process problem. I have no problem with deporting violent gang members, but by invoking the Alien Enemies Act, this allows the president to deport anyone from that country who is 14 years or older. It doesn't matter they have any kind of potential gang affiliation. And to me, that just rubs me the wrong way. That seems to me to be fundamentally ill-considered and unfair.
Yeah, I think that's the whole point. And you'll likely see the Supreme Court give the president a win narrowly. They will very much know. You say you can't apply it broadly to all Guatemalans, particularly you can't be deporting Guatemalan children, even though they're here illegally. That can't be used with this law. So you can maybe use this law if you're targeting individuals that are known to be violent, that are invading. We haven't had a big incident of a terrorist who's come across the border illegally. I think that may happen, and the day that happens, this conversation changes really dramatically. But, the ties to the fentanyl trade are real. The ties to the coyotes, the organized gangs that are, bringing people to America illegally, and so many die. There are some real problems with that, and I think the administration's right in the narrow way. And I think you're right that the Supreme Court could very much give the president what looks like a victory, but I can't imagine it will be a wholesale endorsement of applying this too broadly.
Yeah. So it sounds like you and I are at least in agreement on the sort of the due process. I guess I'll call it the due process aspect of this, maybe.
Mike, I'm not so sure on that.
Okay.
I'm a little torn on granting due process rights, granting to people that are here illegally. You know, somebody comes across the border and suddenly they have the due process becomes a de facto 10-year free ticket to be here and multiple appeals. I think the court, when it digs into this issue more, may limit the kind of rights that a citizen gets versus those from a foreign country.
Okay. Any other thoughts on this ruling before we move on?
No, I mean, it ties into some of the other issues that I think we might talk about regarding illegal immigration and the deployment of ICE. But we've got a full plate and lots happening in politics this week.
Yeah, absolutely. So do you want to maybe move on? We can talk about another ruling that didn't work out so well for the president about troops in L.A.?
There you go. I do. Give me a second. Here we are. Sorry. I wrote a nice intro, Mike, that I'm excited to share. All right. So listen, on Tuesday, September 2nd, 2025, federal judge Charles Breyer in San Francisco, you know how that cues up the conservatives, ruled that the Trump administration's deployment of U.S. military troops to Los Angeles was illegal, which at its peak, you may remember, included about 4,000 troops from the California National Guard and another 700 troops, Marines, from Camp Pendleton. Now, the rationale, if you remember at the time, it was a response to riots that were happening in Los Angeles. They were happening against ICE immigration enforcement actions, against ICE agents. But the riots, we talked about this last time, Mike, they were really ugly. Saw real violence against not just federal individuals, but against some of the local cops trying, bricks being hurled down on them. There was some really ugly violence. Now, the judge ruled, though, that the deployment violated the Posse Comitatus Act. We're reaching back to the old standards and the old norms here. Posse Comitatus Act was an 1878 statute, and it very distinctly prohibits the use of federal forces for domestic law enforcement. Now, I remember my colleague, Jim Mattis, who was the Secretary of Defense and a colleague of mine at the Hoover Institution, and when he was working for President Trump in his first term, said, couldn't do this, couldn't do that, Posse Comitatus. It's one thing you hear in the military a lot when people say, gee, the military should just go do this. Well, we can't, because of this act. Now, the White House had argued the deployment was to protect federal buildings and to enforce federal immigration laws, so it wasn't law enforcement more generally. But the judge wrote a sharp rebuke. And here's a quote. "There were indeed protests in Los Angeles and some individuals engaged in violence," Breyer wrote, "yet there was no rebellion, nor was civilian law enforcement unable to respond to the protests and enforce the law." Breyer also found that Secretary of Defense, I can't believe how often this word's coming up. Secretary of Defense Hegseth improperly asserted a constitutional exception to expand the troop operations to include 4 activities that military normally isn't allowed to do domestically: security patrols, crowd control, traffic control, and riot control. So now I think what makes this case interesting is that it was filed in June by California Governor Gavin Newsom, who, you guys are, keeping score. He's in the early polls for the next presidential race. He's in the pole position as the top likely Democratic nominee. So this case is literally Newsom versus Trump. And since then, the White House has deployed National Guard troops for other activities to fight crime directly. First, in the federal city, Washington, D.C., and more recently, they're talking about Chicago, they're talking about New Orleans, and that's in the balance right now. Mike, what's your interpretation of all this?
Well, I think I was fascinated by the administration's core argument, which you mentioned, that there is this constitutional exception to Posse Comitatus. And how the argument goes is that, well, the president is commander in chief, meaning that he has the inherent power to use the armed forces however he deems necessary to protect federal property, federal personnel, federal functions, or even if it's a potential threat to property, personnel, or functions. That is just a broad, sweeping executive power, which would make Posse Comitatus effectively meaningless. And in fact, that's what Breyer said. He said, Congress didn't enact this just to have it nullified whenever the executive says protection of federal functions, and boom, it's just to do whatever you want with the military. So, and I think the argument, is not really one that I think will hold up under appeal. But I think it's interesting because it really goes to the mindset of how far you can go with an extreme unitary executive view. And I think that's about as extreme as it gets. And certainly I'm not comfortable with the military engaging in law enforcement functions. Even, some people say, well, what about you have military police? Even that's a very different sort of thing. And so I think having anyone put in there in our cities with U.S. citizens trying to do domestic crowd control, law enforcement, that sort of thing, who's not really trained for it, that is a disaster waiting to happen. And I think that's why it should only be a last resort and not to deal with faux emergencies.
Well, certainly small government conservatives would agree. And yet my frustration is that, politics and the law are different issues. And there's a lot of overlap. But I think the president's winning the political game in the political arena because the crime in cities is out of control. The rioting that's permitted is out of control. The lawlessness with the homeless situation, having lived in the San Francisco area for 12 years, I can tell you every year was more depressing. It's being allowed to get worse. And so when I hear liberals, frankly, whine, how dare he do this? And there's some part of me that agrees because I don't like to see the federal government get too big. I just want to say, hey, mow your own lawn. When your lawn is so out of control and somebody comes along with a lawnmower and you're like, well, how dare you? You've got to come back to the root problem has been allowed to fester in so many of these cases to such an extreme. President Trump's got a mighty big lawnmower, right? So I think we need to focus on what's failed with democratic governance in some of these cities. And, you can plug me on this, Mike. I think you mentioned.
Absolutely.
I've written about this in my Substack. Democrats have a crime problem. And you look at Democratic run cities and they are, statistically significantly worse in terms of a lot of this disorder.
And I read that. I read all your Substacks and everyone else should too. We're going to have a link in the show notes. There's a plug for you. But it's a heartfelt one. But I think that it's important to consider this in context. You're right that the most dangerous cities in violent crime are run by Democrats. But of course, almost all major U.S. cities are run by Democrats. So it's kind of hard to sort of do the counterfactual of what if Republicans ran a city that's so many cities that size. But even more than that, I think it's important to look at trend lines. When I was teaching methods, I'd always say, don't just look at the numbers. That's a snapshot, but look at the trend lines. And when you look at the trend lines for violent crime, for crime in general, it looks like a ski slope starting in the 1990s. And you say, you could have a serious toboggan ride on this sucker. That's important to keep in mind. Crime in San Francisco is, issue, but crime in San Francisco is also declining rapidly. So, they had like a 20-year low for violent crime. Detroit has had really huge decreases in violent crime and property crime and homicides and all that sort of thing. And so I agree with you that Democrats have a crime problem, but I would put it somewhat differently. I would say Democrats have a crime perception problem because Donald Trump is fantastic at convincing people that crime is out of control and that L.A. and Chicago and all these places are absolutely cesspools of crime. When the case is that, well, no, they're not. They're actually a lot safer than they've been for the last 20, 30 years. And in fact, when you take a look at, and as you know, this one of the charts in your Substack, that Chicago, Los Angeles, and New York actually have less crime per capita than Dallas, Fort Worth, which is a Republican area. And so I think that context gets lost. And so I get what the president's doing politically, and it makes a lot of sense because people believe that crime is crazy and out of control. And so it is a problem, but I think it's a perception problem, which in a way is much harder to deal with because
I'll just disagree. I just think you're crazy.
Okay.
I think the crime statistics are very difficult because they're not zip code by zip code available. It's very hard to distinguish crime in the greater MSA. It's a lot of the data are these metropolitan areas. So, Austin's crime, Dallas crime, what's the MSA? If instead we looked at what's truly the inner cities and how bad things have gotten, those tend to be more democratic. And then the nearby suburbs, much different. I think you've got a fair point that, cities, urban areas are different. And yet, even though homicides are down, there's been some really good stuff out there. I think Megan McArdle at the Washington Post has written brilliantly on this. It's the disorder, right? It's the It's the trash. It's the tolerance of homeless people, which to me is just heartbreaking. You shouldn't treat your fellow man that, well, they're on concrete. What are we going to do? I mean, let's maybe involuntarily incarcerate some people and get them treatment, not prison, but some folks are not functionally able to care for themselves. And I think it has gotten worse. So I can't agree with everything, Mike. So I'm going to say throw the crazy flag on that.
Running a business comes with a lot of what ifs. But luckily, there's a simple answer to them. Shopify. It's the commerce platform behind millions of businesses, including Thrive Cosmetics and Momofuku. And it'll help you with everything you need. From website design and marketing to boosting sales and expanding operations, Shopify can get the job done and make your dream a reality. Turn those what ifs into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
What if buying a new appliance felt like a win for your home and your wallet? Save up to 50% plus up to an extra $600 on select major appliances at the Best Buy Appliances Labor Day sale. Learn more at bestbuy.com. Best Buy. Imagine that.
I guess in some ways, I know a lot of Republicans, well, some Republicans would argue that when we see gun deaths, mass shootings, that's less of a gun issue than a mental health issue. And I think there's something to be said for applying that same logic to the sort of things you mentioned, like so many homeless people that, I mean, even here in Cincinnati, I'll walk around and there are clearly a lot of people who just they're not okay mentally. And so I would say that then if you're going to extend that logic, well, okay, then let's actually do some things. But it seems like on the one hand, there are at least some Republicans who say, well, it's not guns. It's these crazy people, these homeless people. Well, then if we don't give these folks any place to go, if we don't give them any sort of basic support, then we're not really addressing the fundamental causes. And it doesn't matter how many cops you put on the street or how many people you put in jail, which is, I would argue, actually more expensive in the long run, that you're not really addressing what's causing this, what's destroying these lives in the first place.
Yeah. And I think, again, why has this happened? Why has it happened everywhere? You see panhandlers, I think, much more aggressively than when I was young, because it's become a national issue, right? And it shouldn't be. I think Cincinnati should be able to have laws that are way different than other cities and states, and they can. The federal government the federal courts have declared a lot of these are, fundamental rights to live how you want to live, and that you can't involuntarily incarcerate people. More importantly, it's free speech. And I just disagree. I don't think that the national government should be saying any behavior can be boiled down to speech. So when you're in public property, in a highway, whether you're protesting or whether you're asking for money, that's not what that's for. And you should be able to be arrested. When you're sleeping on a city sidewalk, that's for people to walk. In fact, it got so bad in San Francisco that there was a counter case, because apparently it's all lawfare now, where an individual who had a wheelchair said, I can't get around the city safely because you've allowed so many people to live on sidewalks. It's not public property. They've actually stolen it. So it's not a free speech issue. It's a property issue. But unfortunately, federalism and the 10th Amendment, I mean, who knows on this? Who knows out there, listeners, what the 10th Amendment is? It was never repealed, but it's basically been completely neutered, and that's a shame.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. And I think that's, Judge Breyer pointed out that in his ruling at one point that President Trump wants to be the leader of a national police force. And I think actually that ideal probably has a lot of appeal on some level to the president. But this, I think, again, is an illustration of Donald Trump is many things, but a conservative is not really one of those things,
If I had his ear, I would just beg him, Mr. President, let's think about this. Let's ask the David Petraeus question. How does this end? I mean, if you send federal troops, National Guard, federalized troops into Chicago, and it works like it's worked in D.C. and crime is brought down dramatically. I think the mayor of D.C. thanked the president, and people can feel it. Being around Union Station feels safer. What do we do, though, when they're there? Mike, how does it end? How do you ever take them out? I think Chicago might say, you know what? We do. We need them here. Why don't the people of Ohio and why don't the people of Texas pay for the policing of Chicago? And then at some point you go, they don't. Again, my ultimate issue is who pays? And we've got a deficit problem, guys.
Well, and to me, I think that's a really important issue, because I would argue that using these National Guard troops, especially, and these are men and women who have other jobs and are, being pulled away from that. and they're not really trained for this. I would argue that's incredibly inefficient, and it's at best a stopgap. And what we really need to see is states and cities stepping up and providing the resources for a level of both enforcement and social services to deal with this problem that really hasn't been the case.
Yeah, exactly.
So, I mean, but what would a more conservative, libertarianish sort of approach to this be? What would you think? Because I certainly understand the approach from the left of this, because it's basically my approach. But I mean, how do you see this? Because it seems like you agree with me that putting in these troops is at best a stopgap that should be used for just emergency measures. But what do you see as a more conservative friendly way?
Well, if you're a Thomas Jefferson small government person, you just don't want the federal government to do these things, because when you nationalize everything, you lose that essential character of experimentation, and different states and cities can have different policies. So on the other hand, as just a regular conservative who believes one of our core issues is law and order, and you see the disorder, you know, this is reaping the whirlwind of defund ICE, defund the police, every criminal is a victim. I mean, no. So there's a conflict of conservative issues right here. I think on the political scale, though, crime, and as we said earlier, the disorder that people see on the streets, the lack of safety you feel when you're walking with your children in a public park as twilight arrives, it's intolerable. So it's frustrating, though, because what I'd like to see are bad cities with bad policies, and I don't, you know how I mean that. When they enact a policy that doesn't work, other cities can learn and go in the opposite direction. The federal troops being sent in disrupts that experiment and ruins it.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I mean, but I think back to the politics of it, I think politically this is a very smart move by the president. I think he's really in touch with how a lot of people feel about that, and whether I'm right that these perceptions of crime are overblown or I'm not, it's still a very powerful political issue. And so I really think it puts a lot of Democrats, particularly on the progressive left, into sort of a box, because the typical reaction on the left is armed troops with weapons, with rifles in the streets. That makes me feel real uncomfortable, but that's not necessarily the general feeling, I think, of that. And I think we can get kind of trapped in our own bubbles on this and not realize that it's tricky. That the response to this is really tricky.
Well, again, words matter, right? It's my theme for what we're talking about today. And I just feel like the liberal penchant in the last decade to play word games. The border's never been more secure, said, Biden's press secretary. When people, don't believe your own eyes, don't believe the flood. That's not secure. We don't want to call them vagrants anymore. They're called homeless. No, we don't want to call them homeless. They're unhoused. Let's stop with the word games and deal with the facts. You've got people on the street. It's not about the cost of housing. It's a mental health crisis. But, playing word games doesn't solve it. It makes it worse. I think Trump wins that every day of the week.
Yeah. Fortunately, I think you're right. You're right on that. Any other thoughts on the Democrats' crime problem or the LA ruling, or any related issues here?
No, I think we've covered it pretty well, and there's so much else that we can get into.
So yeah, moving on to the next thing we wanted to talk about. For a while now, I have been predicting / hoping that the Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit would find that President Trump doesn't have the authority to impose most of his tariffs, essentially upholding that Court of International Trade's ruling. And so far, so good for my prediction. After about a week ago, not quite in time for us to get on last week's show, after the appeals court concluded that the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, or IEEPA, which the president cited as his legal authority, doesn't even mention tariffs, with the majority pointing out that, other statutes granting the president tariff power explicitly use the word tariff and impose limits on the use of such power. So we're getting into words matter again. I'm picking up on Tim's theme here. The majority also found that tariffs are taxes, and Article 1 of the Constitution vests taxing power in Congress. So therefore, without a clear delegation of tariff power, the president cannot unilaterally impose tariffs. Now, the dissenters in this 7-4 decision argued for a broad reading of the IEEPA, contending that the phrase regulate importation in the law can encompass imposing tariffs, and that as an It's an emergency measure. Congress was intentionally general in its terminology to let the president have more flexibility to respond to emergencies. Now, the appeals court put its ruling on hold until October 14th to give the administration the opportunity to appeal to the Supreme Court, which they did this week. They also requested that the court expedite its consideration of the case to the maximum extent feasible. Their argument was that the legal uncertainty really undermines the president's ability to conduct real-world diplomacy and to protect the national security and the economy of the United States. But even if the Supreme Court agrees to expedited consideration, well, their new term doesn't begin until the first Monday in October, and it's unlikely they'd be able to hear the case and reach a decision much before December. Hell, December would be like practically lightning fast. We're talking probably more realistically sometime in 2026. Well, Tim, I definitely want to hear your thoughts as an economist on these tariffs as policy. But before we get to that, what's your take on the appellate court's decision?
Mike, I'll leave the legal stuff to you. I think it's going to be a challenge to the president that how to defend this as an emergency more than whether he can technically apply tariffs. Because is there an emergency with every country? It's just, I think it's a tough circle to square. But on the substance of tariffs, I think there's been a lot of misinformation. And so I did write about this too. Are tariffs bad? Are they a tax? Yes. Do they hurt the economy? Sure. But all taxes do. So I think it's really a question of what's the best kind of tax to apply. You got to tax something if you want to fund all the good stuff, the tanks and the Social Security benefits. So I like a tax on consumption versus saving. That's what a tariff does. I like a tax that applies to foreign producers more than domestic. That's what a tariff does. So, and then separately, I think the president has really changed the narrative about the sense that foreign countries had huge tariffs on our exports, but we essentially couldn't do much to them. And by the same token, they had these hidden tariffs, right? These essentially quotas. They would use health and safety standards. So America's this free trade giant, and it's like a whale with all the little lampreys that are attached. It just felt deeply unfair. He's changed that narrative. They're on notice. Even if the court ruling says yes, and the Supreme Court backs it up, it's not this emergency, you're going to probably see a lot more legislation that goes through the House that in the past maybe wouldn't have passed at all. House of the Representatives has the power of the purse, Mike. So I'm going to skip the legal stuff because you know that better, but I want to jump right to this. Is it a regressive tax? I saw this question the other day. No, the whole point is it's flat. When you charge a tariff of 20%, and if some of that flows through the American people, it's a perfectly flat tax. I love that about it, that it's not progressive, regressive. It's flat. We all bear the burden equally, and that's really what should bring us together as a democracy. Let's decide if we like this kind of tax better versus taxes on, let's say, working people's wages.
Well, on that issue, I want to maybe push back a little bit, because it seems to me that, well, maybe I'm defining regressive differently, but when I think of regressive taxes, I think of taxes that have a disproportionate effect on lower income folks. And to me, flat tax is, well, depending on what it's on, but kind of a generalized flat tax, which at least some of the, so much is covered by these tariffs. It seems to me that while it may be flat, but it actually is regressive in the sense that it will disproportionately affect lower income folks.
Let me just say, Massachusetts for a long time had a flat income tax, single rate. Everybody paid the same rate. And in fact, if you have an income exemption, every dollar under, say, $10,000 that a household earns, there's no tax. But above that, it's a flat rate. That actually ends up being progressive because if somebody only makes $10,000, their tax rate zero, whereas a wealthy guy making $1 million is essentially paying the full percentage. So even when you have a flat rate tax, it can be progressive. A tariff, I don't know how you'd say it's a disproportion. Maybe you'd say, well, poor people use more tariffs as part of their consumption bundle than wealthy people. But I think we got to be careful about playing a word game there. This is as flat as it gets. Some people don't like flat taxes at all. So they'll say, oh, it's regressive. Well, okay, maybe it isn't progressive, and that's a fair critique. But let's at least give it the respect that it deserves. It's a flat tax.
Okay, it is. Yeah, it is right. Flat by right. Okay, absolutely. And on that definition, I can accept that. But I guess more generally on these tariffs, right now, it's been a while since Liberation Day, as President Trump called it.
Oh, that's right, Liberation Day.
But I mean, so the tariffs, they've led to some price increases, but the July inflation rate was 2.7%, unchanged from June. The market seemed to be looking good. The Fed seems ready to cut interest rates at its September meeting, and that should give some extra juice for the economy. We've already collected nearly $200 billion in tariff revenue, I believe. I mean, I guess one can look at that and say, and ask the question, is it possible that President Trump and his economic team are right and that the tariffs will be a net gain for the U.S. economy? Now, most economists would say nope. What do you think?
Well, I am not sure that they matter that much on the grand macro scale, but let me add something dramatic happened with the jobs numbers. And there was a massive revision a month ago. I know this has been discussed already, but Trump, the day, this first Friday of last month, the numbers came out and they had massive revisions. Apparently, they were saying hundreds of thousands of jobs were being created during the summer. Suddenly they said, oh, no, sorry, we were off by hundreds of thousands. It was essentially no job. This month, the numbers came out yesterday, 22,000 jobs as of the first Friday of this month. That's a really low number. So suddenly it looks like we've had 4 months of weak job creation, and it didn't look like that 30 days ago. So a lot of people are saying it must be the tariffs. I think certainly the Federal Reserve was saying the economy is robust. Look how many jobs there are in the payroll numbers. Now they're changing their tune. And I wouldn't be surprised if we see Fed action in light of this recent number very, very quickly. So that ties into the tariffs debate. I think it's probably wrong to blame tariffs alone. Because if there's another number, and Mike, sorry to get so technical.
No, please do.
Payroll numbers, fine. Only 22,000, you're right. And you can say, well, maybe that's because there are fewer immigrants, right? And maybe that's because they've been cutting the federal workforce, which we have to do to get the budget under control. But there's another number the Labor Department puts out in that employment report from a totally different survey. It's called the Household Survey. You're not going to companies, you're calling people in their homes. The Household Survey gives you the unemployment rate. It's the other big number that's reported. The unemployment rate was, I think it was just 4.2%. I got the report right here in front of me. Let me double check. Among major worker groups, unemployment rates for adult men, 4.1%. Adult women, 3.8. Teenagers, 13.9. That's not out of, then they do some demographic groups by race. The bottom line is a 4.2% unemployment rate, which isn't trending aggressively up, essentially unchanged. The unemployment rate at 4.3%, not 4.2. That's a low number. Yeah. And so you're not seeing the, a warning sign on the dashboard right here. And I think it's too early to say that the tariffs are to blame when basically you have what looks like natural rate of unemployment, or otherwise it would be called full employment.
I would think that given the fact that a lot of companies stocked up before the Liberation Day thing, and that this can take some time to sort of work its way into the economy. Even so, I would expect that by the end of the year, because even if the appeals court's decision is upheld, we're going to have these tariffs in place almost certainly for the rest of 2025. I would expect that if there really was some sort of major significant economic inflationary shock or other shock because of these tariffs, we would really see it fairly clearly by the end of the year. What do you think?
I think that's right. The economic forces tend to operate slowly. I'm going to reserve judgment myself on Trump's policies. And, the American people do not get caught up in these details. They do not vote on policy. Brian Kaplan's got a great book, and I know he's been a friend of this show, The Theory of the Rational Voter, The Myth of the Rational Voter is the title of the book. The median voter is not going to get caught up in the details of tariff theory and research papers. They're going to say, do I have a job? Does my neighbor have a job? Are the eggs at the grocery store, inflating out of control? So let's talk again. I think by Christmas time, it'll be crystal clear if there was a tariff shock and if it was negative or positive. You might see then the White House reckon with, well, why are we doing this? I think we want to apply it to countries that are like China, which has just been a proven rival that's stealing our intellectual property, versus Mexico. Mexico's been actually a really good free trade partner for a long time. That's been a win-win. So as an economist, I'd say let's be a little bit more discriminating in which countries we apply tariffs to.
$1 million. Free to play. You just need to survive. It's the Fanatics NFL Survivor Pool. Pick one team to win each week. Get it right, move on. Get it wrong, you're out. The last fan standing take home a guaranteed $1 million cash prize. And for every player who joins, we add $1 to the pot, up to $10 million. The Fanatics NFL Survivor Pool. Play free on the Fanatics app. App access open to all. Must be 21 plus and joined by 9/8 to play. No purchase necessary. U.S. only. Void where prohibited. Subject to complete terms. See fanatics.com/game rules.
As a sports fan, I have to confess. Sometimes the game gets kind of boring. That's when I unfold my Samsung Galaxy Z Fold 7 and use multi-window viewing on its large screen. Boring game? I'm checking out my fantasy baseball league at the same time. Score still 1-0? I'm replying to emails in the other window, scoring points with the boss. Semifinals finally getting exciting? I'm buying tickets to the finals and booking my flights. Can your phone do that?
The new Galaxy Z Fold 7. Get yours at Samsung.com.
Another thing, I guess, to me in this conversation is that's important to bring in is non-tariff barriers, because I get that they can impose significant costs on U.S. exporters. Not only that, but they can be pretty hard, I think, to clearly calculate, because some non-tariff barriers can be for legitimate health and safety reasons. And I guess I would be okay with any presidential administration taking a good hard look at non-essential non-tariff barriers, things that aren't related to health, safety, or national security of our trading partners, and to try to get a sense of what they amounted to, and then sort of try to work with these countries to eliminate them with the stick, potentially, of reciprocal tariffs. But that's not how this rolled out. I mean, the whole formula that was used looked like it was done in 10 minutes with an LLM, essentially. And so just a haphazard way this was done, because I feel like in so much of what President Trump does and says, there's this important kernel of truth. But then in terms of the execution, the crazed, wild, let's just throw some stuff at the wall and see what sticks execution, that's what I oftentimes have huge problems with, because I do think he's right that countries like China and other countries are imposing a lot of both tariff and, more importantly, arguably, non-tariff barriers, and that's a real problem. But this is not the way to address that problem, I would argue.
And so here's an interesting way to think about it, that it is the non-tariff barriers. Countries will play games, but bizarrely, the ones that have been the worst offenders, like Europeans, were never as open to free trade as the United States was. And yet the European countries, the ones with the highest tariffs and the highest limitations, are laggards. I mean, their income per capita in real terms is, in the wealthiest places like Germany, maybe 80% of our average income here. You look at Spain, it's closer to 50%. And so this mercantilist view, still sort of haunting the world, does not make a country richer. I think where the president's on really solid ground is you can go beyond trade to where you're actually, if we want to sell, let's say, General Motors cars in China, that they say, well, you have to do it through a subsidiary that the ownership is by some Chinese company, and you have to share all of your patents with us and expose, your secrets, trade secrets, and we won't steal those. Of course, they've been terrible at this for a long time. That goes beyond the non-tariff barriers into actually invasive and theft, intellectual theft. So I think the president has really changed the conversation. He gets credit for that, but let's not lose sight of the fact that free trade's good. And if we really want to dominate the world, I think being the free trade leader is important to preserve.
Yeah. I certainly agree with that. Sometimes I wonder President Trump talks a lot about bringing back manufacturing and other things like that, but I sometimes wonder if President Trump understands or is even familiar with the concept of comparative advantage.
Yeah, I think the president is a strong believer in two things. He doesn't like when America gets taken advantage of. He thinks a trade imbalance is a symbol of that. So it's not the technical details. It's like, why is there this trade imbalance? I tend to disagree with him on that, but I think I agree with him that there has been places where countries have taken advantage. And he believes that unlimited immigration is not healthy. The rest of this, the president's really good about, hey, man, let's do what works. And crime's out of control. He's not a big respecter of what other people would call norms, but the norms haven't made our people safer. I mean, anybody out there with a kid who's been hurt by a crime, You sort of don't care about what the law says anymore. You just want security. So on this issue, though, you're right. The president really just fundamentally distrusts trade imbalances. I'm less so, but I'll take it. I think he gets a lot of other things right.
According to some data that I've seen, the tariffs are estimated, various estimates, but if you kind of try to triangulate, estimated to cost the average American household around $4,000 a year. And I compared that to what the OB3 tax cut extensions are supposed to save, and that's around $2,900 per year. But of course, most of the tax cut savings, which makes sense, would go to higher income households because they already pay more in taxes. But a disproportionate amount of the tariff costs end up being borne by lower income households. It just seems to me to be not necessarily a very coherent policy or good way to raise money. And I know this gets into an issue that's a big concern for you. The fact that, we have now these massive tax cuts that have been extended, and sure, the tariffs will help to pay for some of that, but we're still on a pretty unsustainable footing. And I think if we try to draw that money from people who have the least ability to pay, that also is a problem for sustainability.
Yeah, the long-term mechanics of when does the bill come due on these decades and decades of deficits. So the bill comes due when the rest of the world doesn't want to buy our debt. They lose confidence in it. And what's been happening is the Treasury's been issuing more and more short-term debt to keep those, or to try to control interest rates. And the gamesmanship may be up. Ray Dalio recently said there'll be some kind of crisis where you have to either cut more spending or you're going to have to raise taxes. One of the things the president's strong at is he's responsive. And he'll try something, doesn't work, and he'll pretend he never tried it. Like, we got to stop doing this. And so I like the fact that he's not as dogmatic. I think the Biden administration could have taken a page out of that book because the immigration policies weren't working. And they just, for years, doubled down on it and probably cost the Democrats the White House. So we will see come December of this 2025 first, full term of first year of the president's second term. And we'll see what course corrections are made.
Yeah, I guess when I agree with you in terms of when we know we have a problem. And so for me, the marker the single marker, probably a single marker is not good, but the single marker I tend to look at is the yield on 10-year treasuries. And right now it's not, you obviously would want it to be lower essentially, right, than higher, which would suggest we're in a better position, I would expect. And
that's exactly right.
And we're in pretty good shape. We're not in bad shape right now. That hasn't been, it's been creeping up a little bit, but it's not like you take a look at where it is compared to, say, the 1990s or even certainly the 1980s. And we're not in that bad shape so far, I don't think.
No, those are the rate numbers to look at. And when they start to spike and the Federal Reserve will say, well, we're going to lower rates. At some point, they can't lower rates. We're the one country in the world that's been able to sort of ignore the market when there's a crisis. Other countries have to raise rates to borrow. We get to lower because we're the hegemon. Those days may be numbered. It will be a fascinating thing to unfold, and maybe we'll have to balance our budget as well. Like I said, in the short term, the tariffs are a ripple in the big tidal wave of debt. They're not gonna fill the hole. I don't think they're going to cause an economic recession either. But at some point that bill comes due. Now, my theory on this is actually an easy problem to solve. It just takes what economists call credible commitment. So we won't have to balance the budget. The Congress won't suddenly have to fill this $2 trillion hole in 1 year. They'll just have to make a credible commitment. And I think a constitutional amendment does that. And suddenly you'd see natural interest rates drop by a point or two. So if you've got you know what this means. If you have a 7% interest rate on a housing mortgage that you're getting, that would drop to 5% if Congress would pass an amendment declaring that it has to balance the budget over the long term. So there's an easy fix to this, and it's something that we can spread that reconciliation, though, over a long period.
And I guess, the one thing we really hadn't gotten into so much, and I guess I should mention this a bit, is on the legal aspect of this, which I'll speak to at least a little bit here. I think it's important to keep in mind that the judges did not question the legitimacy of the president invoking an emergency, and that, at least to me, it was surprising that the decision was actually so close. Two of the four dissenters are appointed by President Obama, and actually President Trump then thanked them thank them for their courage, although I think he got it wrong. He thought there was only one Obama appointed judge. You said that, but the second guy, I guess, didn't get any props from the president. But anyway, so I think this is interesting legally because from the beginning, I argued that on the major questions doctrine alone, this was an easy call, that this is clearly an action that has major economic ramifications. And therefore, if there's not clear congressional authorization for it, which I don't think there is, then it's not within the president's power. But when I read more carefully the arguments of the four dissenters, again, including those two Obama appointees, I started to wonder about that because, as they pointed out, the major questions doctrine focuses on decisions of administrative agencies, not the president of the United States. That's an important distinction. And they also argued that, well, even if you want to apply this, when we're talking about foreign affairs and emergency context, the president should be given more deference. And I think that I can see those arguments resonating with, I think, enough justices on the Supreme Court where before this, if you would have asked me 2 weeks ago, what are the odds that the Supreme Court eventually overturns a significant part of these Trump tariffs, I would have said 80%. Now I'm thinking, I don't know, probably like a 50-50 sort of things. I think the interesting logic, in some ways convincing to me, of the dissenters makes me question exactly how much of a slam dunk this is. I don't think it is anymore. And so
I think I mark my words, I think even the conservatives on the Supreme Court, they are going to say this isn't an emergency. What's the emergency? And let me draw an analogy. If I go to the barber and I pay $50 for a haircut, it makes I can't believe that's how much a haircut can cost now. When I was a kid, it was like $5, but nowadays $50 for a haircut. And I'm happy. I leave the store. I've got, a nice haircut, but I've got a trade deficit with the barber of $50. Now, is that a bad thing? Well, like the language that we use of what is a trade deficit just means that we had a transaction. We don't have to buy the haircut. We don't have to buy the cars from South Korea or Japan. But people want that vehicle. So budget deficit, you got to pay it back. A trade deficit, you don't pay it back. You paid it once already. There's no emergency there. I think where the president can win is saying, no, there's an emergency exploitation by some of these countries that are stealing our intellectual property through what they're enacting on these individual corporate trade arrangements. That's emergent. But let me go back to the job numbers because I pulled these up, Mike. The employment to population ratio is 59.6% in August. It was 59.6 in July. That's not a crisis. There are 163.4 million people employed in America as of August 2025. That's up from 163.1 million people. So that looks like job growth on the order of 300,000. It's different than the payroll number, but that's the whole point. There are different ways to look at this. The unemployment rate went from 4.2 to 4.3, not an emergency. So I think the Supreme Court is, when this gets to them, will say, you're misapplying the word. Words have meaning. Yeah, and back to the theme. Very nice to wrap things up. I will disagree with you on that. I think that when it comes to the Supreme Court, the majority that rules to largely uphold most of, if not all, of Donald Trump's tariffs will give great deference to the presidential invocation of an emergency and say essentially that, hey, that's the president's call. We're not going to second guess the elected president of the United States and what constitutes an emergency. If Congress wants to write legislation to require the president to meet certain criteria before declaring an emergency, they can do that. But since they haven't, we're going to defer to the president. I hope you're more right than I am on this, but I think I'll take that bet. Maybe we can't wager on air, but I'll take that just intellectually. Let's keep score.
There you go. I like it. Well, on that note, I think we will close the show for today. But hey, if there's anything that we talked about that you disagreed with, that you particularly liked, or you just have a question about, we would love to hear from you. You can reach us through email at mail@politicsguys.com. Also, Facebook or X. We always put links in the show notes. And there's also our Discord discussion forum for supporters. I'm on that all the time. You should check it out. As a supporter, you don't just get access to the Discord. You get ad-free versions of everything we release, the full-length midweek episode instead of just that 10 to 15-minute snippet preview. And, well, there's some other stuff as well. We hope you check it out. I always put the support links in the show notes, or you can go to politicsguys.com/support. And if you want to get the full midweek show, but financially you just can't swing supporting us right now, not a problem. Just send me an email, mike@politicsguys.com, and I will get that taken care of for you. I'm more than happy to do it. And whether you support us or not, it really helps out a lot if you can subscribe, rate and review us on whatever podcast app you're using, and share episodes on social media. And finally, before we go, as always, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller. We'll be back with a new episode for you next week. We hope you'll join us.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,